York, this is Democracy Now!
What we're talking about here is beginning a process of decolonization for Puerto Rico. The system of the fiscal control board, the odious debt that has been imposed upon the Puerto Rican people to pay for years on end, these are all mechanisms of colonization over Puerto Rico. And so we need to address those directly and move on to creating a more just system all over Puerto Rico and then in the United States as well.
Protests are continuing in Puerto Rico days after mass demonstrations forced Governor Ricardo Rosselló to step down this Friday. This comes as fear is growing in Puerto Rico that the political turmoil could lead to the unelected Financial Oversight and Management Board seizing more power. We'll go to San Juan for the latest. Then to Brazil, where the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest is rapidly escalating under President Jair Bolsonaro. The equivalent of 3 soccer fields are being destroyed every minute.
At this time, the main actor in the environmental problems in Brazil is sitting in the chair of the President of the Republic, in charge of the country. All deforestation must be avoided. It is not welcome. It is no longer tolerated. We can grow the country without deforestation.
And we look at the privately owned Stewart Detention Center in Georgia, where at least 4 immigrants have died over the past 2 years, including one last week. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In California, police have identified the gunman who killed 3 people, including 2 children, at a mass shooting Sunday at the Gilroy Garlic Festival as 19-year-old Santino William Legan. He was fatally shot by police at the scene within minutes. Authorities say they're still determining a motive for the attack, but the gunman's social media activity shows him promoting a manifesto on white supremacy just moments before the rampage. He also wrote in a post Sunday, "Why overcrowd towns and pave more open space to make room for hordes of mestizos and Silicon Valley white expletives." Authorities say the gunman used an assault rifle that was purchased legally in Nevada. The AK-47 style weapon could not have been legally purchased in his home state of California because of stricter gun regulations. California Governor Gavin Newsom called the semi-automatic gun a weapon of mass destruction. 6-year-old Stephen Romero was the youngest victim of the shooting. Another child, 13-year-old Kayla Salazar, and 25-year-old student Trevor Irby also lost their lives in the massacre. Last week, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, testified before the Senate saying that domestic terrorism by white supremacists is on the rise. President Trump doubled down on his attacks against Congressmember and House Oversight Chair Elijah Cummings Monday, saying he was to blame for Baltimore's crime rates, and again lashing out over Cummings' questioning at his committee's hearing over the dire conditions for migrants at the U.S. border. This comes after Trump described Baltimore as a disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess that no human being would want to live in. Trump also extended his attacks to civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton as he headed to Baltimore Monday, calling him a con man who hates whites and cops. Sharpton responded to Trump from Baltimore when he arrived.
I marched on him with Central Park 5. I dealt with him on the Bertha issue. He can say what he wants. Calls me a troublemaker. Yes, I make trouble for bigots. I made trouble for him with Central Park. I made trouble with him for birtherism. I'm going to keep making trouble for bigots. As far as me being a con man, if he really thought I was a con man, he'd be nominating me for his cabinet.
Maryland's Republican Governor Larry Hogan called Trump's attacks on Baltimore outrageous and inappropriate. Meanwhile, House Republicans are set to take their annual policy retreat in Baltimore in September. The Senate failed to override presidential vetoes on legislation that would have blocked arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Trump used an emergency declaration in May to push through the contested arms deal without congressional approval. Critics say the weapons could be used on civilians in Yemen. 6 Republicans voted in favor of overriding Trump's vetoes, which he issued last week. In Yemen, air raids on a market killed at least 10 people, including children, in the northern Sada province Monday, according to local reports. The attack attacks were carried out by U.S.-backed Saudi-led forces. The UN's Children in Armed Conflict report found the Saudi-led coalition was responsible for killing or wounding 729 Yemeni children in 2018. The opposition Houthi forces killed or wounded 398 children last year, according to the UN report. In Sudan, activists say at least 5 people were killed Monday after security forces fired on peaceful high school student demonstrators protesting military rule. The victims were between 15 and 17 years old. The killings are believed to have been carried out by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, who protesters say are behind the deadly raid on a protest camp in Khartoum last month that killed an estimated 130 people. Over the weekend, Sudan's Traditional Military Council said their investigation into the June 3rd raid found rogue military personnel were to blame for the deaths of just 87 protesters. Human rights groups and protesters on the ground say the government is deliberately undercounting the deaths. Physicians for Human Rights calls the government investigation biased and inadequate and says it reflects the urgent need for an impartial, independent international investigation. Representatives from the Military Council and the civilian coalition in Sudan are meeting today to discuss details of a power-sharing deal agreed to earlier this month. In Brazil, at least 57 people were killed in a prison gang riot Monday in the state of Pará. Authorities say 16 people were decapitated while others died of asphyxiation after a fire filled the prison with thick smoke. In May, at least 55 prisoners were killed when fights broke out across 4 prisons in the state of Amazonas. Brazil has the 3rd largest prison population in the world. Human rights groups say prisons are massively overcrowded and rife with mistreatment and violence. The Altamira jail, where Monday's riot took place, housed more than twice its capacity of prisoners. President Jair Bolsonaro, who campaigned on a law and order platform, has said he would stuff prison cells with criminals. A new report by Global Witness found 164 people were killed in 2018 for trying to protect the environment. The Philippines ranks top of the list with 30 deaths, while in Guatemala the number of deaths jumped by more than 4 times. The number of recorded deaths also rose sharply in India. Global Witness says activists who are being targeted are defending land and resources that are being exploited for consumer-driven items such as cell phones and jewelry, as well as food. The highest increase in last year's numbers is attributed to killings of water defenders, which includes conflicts over hydropower in Guatemala. Indigenous groups are a particular risk of being targeted. Last week, tribal leader Amira Waiapi was stabbed to death in Brazil by gold miners in the remote village of Amapá. We'll have more on what happened in Brazil with Carlos Ratil, Executive Secretary of Climate Observatory, later in the broadcast. You can also see our interview with Luis Roberto Murillo about activist murders in Colombia at democracynow.org. In Auckland, New Zealand, thousands of Indigenous people are protesting plans for a new housing development on sacred land. Fletcher Building, New Zealand's largest developer, plans to build nearly 500 homes in the Ihumatao. Land defenders have been protesting the move for years, and a group has been camping out on the proposed site for a week. This is Hone Harawira, a Maori activist and former member of the parliament who's been taking part in the mass protest.
Stop ignoring the people here. You can't just make it like this is not happening. You've got to bring the people to the table.
New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern on Friday said no construction would take place for now and promised talks with the Indigenous communities. The record-breaking heat wave that gripped Europe last week is now heading northwards, and scientists warn it could cause an unprecedented melt of Greenland's ice sheet. The UN said this month alone Greenland lost 160 billion tons of surface ice. If the ice sheet melts entirely, it would raise global sea levels by almost 23 feet. Last month was the hottest June ever recorded on Earth, while July is on track to be the hottest month ever. The second Democratic primary debates kick off tonight in Detroit. 20 candidates vying for the 2020 nomination will face off over 2 nights. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders will be among the 10 contenders facing off tonight. And more 2020 news, CNN and MSNBC both announced last week they would hold town halls centered on the climate crisis. This comes after a sustained campaign by climate activists to include a climate-focused debate as part of the primaries. Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Perez has denied such demands, though the DNC is scheduled to vote on a resolution supporting the call next month. Activists celebrated the announcement by the networks, but say a climate debate, not just the town halls, are needed. For CNN's event, participants must meet the same eligibility requirements as the September debates, meaning they must meet certain polling and donation thresholds by August 28th. Ahead of the debates, California Senator Kamala Harris has released her health care proposal, which would allow individuals to buy into Medicare and slowly expand the system over 10 years. Her plan would keep private insurance in the marketplace, but require that those plans adhere to standards and costs set by Medicare. Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign quickly slammed Harris's plan, saying it's, quote, centered around privatizing Medicare, enriching insurance executives, and introducing more corporate greed and profiteering into the Medicare system. Sanders is calling for a single-payer health care system run by the government that would essentially do away with private insurers. Medicare for all. In more 2020 news, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary and San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro has introduced a plan to increase the political power and ensure the rights of indigenous communities. Castro's proposal calls for improvements to housing, health care, economic status, education, and voting rights for Native groups. Castro evoked the struggles at Standing Rock and Mauna Kea in Hawaii on Twitter as he announced his plan and vowed to, quote, strengthen tribal sovereignty, honor treaty commitments, ensure justice for indigenous women, and advance tribal federal partnerships for progress. Philadelphia's Hahnemann University Hospital released its last patient last week and is expected to fully shutter within the coming weeks, laying off over 2,500 union staff and leaving a vacuum in medical services for low-income people in the area. Philadelphia residents and activists have been battling the closure of the 171-year-old institution. They say the private equity executive Joel Friedman, whose firm Paladin Healthcare bought Hahnemann Hospital last year, is seeking to use bankruptcy proceedings to sell the property for development as luxury condos and hotels. Senator Bernie Sanders, who rallied with local residents earlier this month, decried the culture of corporate greed responsible for the closure. Sanders said his Medicare for All plan would include a fund so local governments can purchase hospitals in financial distress. Capital One says a hacker exposed the personal data of its customers, including about 140,000 Social Security numbers and tens of thousands of bank account numbers. Tens of millions of credit card applications were also stolen. The FBI arrested Seattle software engineer Paige Thompson over the breach and charged her with computer fraud and abuse. Thompson's online activity led investigators to her as she allegedly boasted about the hack on social networking sites. Last week, credit bureau Equifax settled for at least $650 million over a 2017 data breach that affected the personal information of more than 147 million consumers, the largest such settlement for a data breach. President Trump signed a bill Monday to permanently fund the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, which provides health care for first responders to the 9/11 terror attacks. First responders have been lobbying for its passage for months. This is Trump speaking at the signing.
And I was down there also, but I'm not considering myself a first responder. But I was down there. I spent a lot of time down there with you.
According to a retired deputy chief from the New York Fire Department, he never saw Trump at Ground Zero. Quote, he said he was a private citizen at the time. I don't know what kind of role he could have possibly played. That was Richard Alice telling the New York Times. According to the 9/11 after the 9/11 attack, Trump boasted his building, 40 Wall Street, had become the tallest building in downtown Manhattan after the collapse of the World Trade Center. The claim was untrue. And volunteers in Ethiopia planted 350 million trees Monday as part of a national campaign to help tackle the global climate crisis. 80% of Ethiopia's population depends on agriculture for its livelihood, but Ethiopia suffers from soil erosion, deforestation, flooding, and harsh drought conditions. According to the organization Farm Africa, less than 4% of Ethiopia's land is forested, down from around 30% at the end of the 19th century. A study released earlier this year found planting 1.2 trillion trees could cancel out 10 years of carbon dioxide emissions. This is scientist Samuel Galletta speaking about the initiative Monday.
The issue of the environment is of major concern, even at the global level, but more so for this country. Most of the problems and famine we see in this country could be linked to the lack of protection for our environment.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Protests are continuing in Puerto Rico days after mass demonstrations forced Governor Ricardo Rosselló to step down. It marks the first time in Puerto Rico's history that protests have toppled a sitting governor. Rosselló's last day in office is this Friday, but it remains unclear who will take his place. Justice Secretary Wanda Vázquez is next in line for the office, but on Sunday she said in a tweet, quote, "I have no interest in occupying the governor's post." However, on Monday, Vázquez's spokeswoman then did not rule out her becoming governor. On Monday, protesters gathered outside Vázquez's office calling for her to resign as Justice Secretary. This is Claudia Sofia Garriaga Lopez, who teaches at Cal State University in Chico.
I think that really what we're talking about here is beginning a process of decolonization for Puerto Rico. The system of the Fiscal Control Board, the odious debt that has been imposed upon the Puerto Rican people to pay for years on end, these are all mechanisms of colonization over Puerto Rico. And so we need to address those directly and move on to creating a more just system all over Puerto Rico and then in the United States as well. I think that part of what we see here is a great inspiration for the rest of the country to see that if we mobilize in large numbers, we don't have to wait for impeachment. We don't have to wait for elections in 2020. We can move Trump out of the presidency, as well as all of these other corrupt politicians who are taking advantage of their political position to enrich themselves and push forward policies that benefit private corporations and definitely not the people of the United States or of Puerto Rico.
Claudia Sofia Garriga Lopez of California State University in Chico. The ongoing protests in Puerto Rico come as concern is growing that the political turmoil could lead to the Financial Oversight and Management Board seizing more power. The board is commonly referred to as La Junta in Puerto Rico. The unelected board runs much of Puerto Rico's affairs, approving any major expenditures and budget decisions. It's also overseen a devastating austerity program. To talk more about the latest in Puerto Rico, we go to San Juan, where we're joined by Manuel Natal. He's an independent member of the House of Representatives of Puerto Rico. He's also a member of the growing grassroots organization Victoria Ciudadana. That is Citizens Victory. Manuel Natal, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So last week, mass protests ousted the governor, Governor Rosselló. He says he will leave on Friday, but has yet to name a replacement since the Secretary of State had resigned in the same text scandal a few weeks before. What is going to happen on Friday?
Well, we are currently at the brink of a constitutional crisis here in Puerto Rico. As you just mentioned, in just 4 days, Ricardo Rosselló's resignation will become effective, and the people of Puerto Rico still don't know who's going to be his replacement. The Legislative Assembly in Puerto Rico has failed to step up to its leadership, particularly within the statehood party, who is the party that the governor currently belongs to. And unfortunately, they don't seem to be hearing the message that people of Puerto Rico have been screaming loud and clear, that we're not only asking for Rosselló's resignation, we're looking to end corruption here in Puerto Rico. And that means that whoever is going to be the substitute to Ricardo Rosselló has to be a candidate that comes out of the consensus with the people of Puerto Rico.
And could you talk about the Justice Minister, Wanda Vázquez, and why many of the protesters are unhappy, even about the possibility that she will be the successor? Her record as a Justice Minister in terms of not even investigating or prosecuting potential corruption in relationship to the aid that was sent from the United States to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria?
They're both cut from the same cloth. When it comes to Wanda Vázquez, she has failed to fulfill her constitutional duties as Secretary of the Department of Justice. In my case particularly, a lot of the corruption that has been signaled out and called out in the now famous Telegram chat, I had been pointing out for the last 2.5 years. I had referred all of that corruption to Wanda Vázquez and the Department of Justice since at least November of 2017. $40 million or $50 million in government contracts to the governor's publicists, the relationship and the conflict of interest with Elias Sanchez, the governor's best man at his wedding, his campaign manager, and his representative of the Fiscal Control Board. I mean, so many examples of things that had been pointed out. The evidence had been provided to Wanda Vázquez and the Department of Justice, and she just continued to become silent, and she was complicit to all of this corruption. So she's obviously inhabilitated to become the next governor of Puerto Rico, and that creates a void and a constitutional crisis here in Puerto Rico that unfortunately the statehood party has not been willing to show its leadership and hear the people of Puerto Rico.
And why it's been so difficult for the governor to name a successor, or even for the statehood party leaders to sort of agree on an interim caretaker governor? Isn't it part of the problem that a lot of them are jockeying to actually run for governor next November?
That's correct, Juan. We have two situations unfolding here. One is that a lot of the possible substitutes to the governor are also involved in the same corruption scandals that led to the governor having to resign. The other situation is that there are a couple of individuals that are looking to put themselves in the best situation towards 2020 and towards running for governor themselves, particularly Tomás Rivera Chats, who's the president of the Senate, and he's a member of the statehood party, and Jennifer Gonzalez, who's currently the resident commissioner of Puerto Rico in Washington, D.C. During that battle, the people of Puerto Rico have become hostage to the statehood party because since they're not able to come together with a solution for short term, so Puerto Rico can finish this term in peace until the next general elections, the people of Puerto Rico have become hostage of these backroom negotiations that are taking place within the statehood party. And we have been put in a level of uncertainty that, like I mentioned before, we're 4 days away from the governor's resignation becoming effective. And we literally don't know who's going to be the next in line to take in place. And not only that, there's so many negotiations, bills that are being signed into law, people that are being put in strategic positions during this transition process that we don't know about. And the governor is not showing face to the people of Puerto Rico. He's doing all this governing of his last days in office behind closed doors, not engaging with any sort of conversations with the press. So we're right now in a very, very dark position.
And what about the control board? Because throughout all of this, the reality is the control board is constantly putting deadlines for budgetary decisions, for spending decisions by the government, and there's no one there to make those decisions at this point. What do you see as the role of the control board? The federal Judge Swain has temporarily suspended action on any of the legal proceedings, meanwhile the Promesa board continues to function.
Well, that's one of the most concerning points out of all of the situation. While we're concentrated on removing Ricardo Rosselló, while we're concentrated and we have come together in a historic cause to, I guess, take out corruption out of Puerto Rico, the Fiscal Control Board has gained more and more power. Before this situation took place, the conversations in Washington were heading in the direction of limiting the powers of the Fiscal Control Board. Since this situation unfolded, the conversations in Washington, D.C. have gone in the different direction. They're talking about giving more power to the Fiscal Control Board, a Fiscal Control Board that does not represent the best interests of the people of Puerto Rico, but rather represents the interests of corporate America and particularly Wall Street. We're talking about vulture funds that are making sure through the Fiscal Control Board that they get paid regardless of what that means in sacrifices, in blood, in tears to the people of Puerto Rico. So I would be very, very careful with the period that Judge Swain has established, in which he has basically paralyzed all the process in terms of the bankruptcy that's going on at the federal level, because what they're actually doing is buying time to push forward the adjustment plan that they want for the people of Puerto Rico. And that adjustment plan means more sacrifice for our pensions, more sacrifice for our workers, more sacrifices for the University of Puerto Rico. And the people of Puerto Rico have already given enough. The austerity policies that have been implemented not only by the Fiscal Control Board, but by the current Rosselló administration, the previous Garcia Padilla administration, have put the people of Puerto Rico at a position of vulnerability. Social inequality have increased to levels that we have never seen here in Puerto Rico. So we have to be very, very careful that while we fight the good fight in terms of removing Ricardo Rosselló from office and making sure that his successor represents the best interests of the people of Puerto Rico, we cannot leave the Fiscal Control Board out of our sight because they're gaining power as we speak, and we need more democracy, not less democracy.
And you have Jose Carrion, the chairman of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, recently became a leader of Latinos for Trump. But I want to go to the popular movement, the people that ultimately ousted the governor, the 500,000 people who marched in the streets. And it wasn't only in San Juan, all over the island, the mass protest after this tech scandal exposed by independent media, the Center for Independent Journalism in Puerto Rico, and the power of the people. So people from across the political spectrum ultimately outraged by the text attacks, the violent, sexist, homophobic attacks, rose up. But how are they organizing now? Is there a kind of umbrella party that will also not just leave things to the governor deciding what's going to happen next before he leaves?
Yes, we're talking about the Ricardo Rosselló's resignation. It's a first step, a necessary first step, but this is not the end of the road. The people of Puerto Rico know that getting Ricardo Rosselló out of office doesn't mean that we're going to get our country back on track. We need to make sure that not only we replace all of the people in government that have failed us, but we need to make sure that we have a political movement that represents the best interests of the people of Puerto Rico. A lot of us are betting on a collective process. We're not looking for individuals that come to save us. We're talking about how we can organize from the ground up. And that's what we're trying to do here in Victoria Ciudadana, which was a political movement that was recently announced as close as in March. We're a coalition of people that have been fighting for justice for Puerto Rico, for equality for Puerto Rico. We're being a progressive movement. We're talking about people that come from the Workers' Party, from unions, from community organizing, from environmental groups, from student leaders at the university. Some of us that have come from some of the main parties here in Puerto Rico, others that ran as independent, but we have come together under this movement under the idea that we can only face this situation as a collective. And if we're united, we're able to beat the corruption of the two-party system here in Puerto Rico. And that's part of the evolution of this protest. We have seen a diversity, a plurality of the individuals that have showed up to this protest. We had close to 1 million people walk the streets of San Juan protesting for Ricardo Rosselló's resignation. That's unheard of. That's never happened in the history of Puerto Rico. The closest thing to that was when the people of Puerto Rico came together to call for the Marina and the U.S. military to get out of Vieques, the Puerto Rican island municipality. So we are at the verge or at the brink of a political revolution here in Puerto Rico, and we have to make sure that all this excitement, all of this action that's taking place, it's geared towards corrective change and to make sure that towards the next election, we have the right people in place to take over government and give it back to the people of Puerto Rico.
Well, Manuel Natal, I wanted to ask you, in terms of Victoria Ciudadana, you yourself had split away from the Commonwealth Party, the PPD, which has always been associated with Commonwealth and since its founding by Luis Muñoz Marín back in 1952. I'm wondering, my sense is that the Promesa, the installation of Promesa signaled the virtual death of the Commonwealth model. And I'm wondering how you see this crisis relating to the longer-term situation of what happens in terms of the status of Puerto Rico.
Well, I think in 2016, in the general election, politics in Puerto Rico changed completely. Close to 20% of the people that voted for the governor's position voted outside of the two-party system. That number is unheard of. An independent candidate, Alexandra Lugaro, got close to 12% of the votes. Another independent candidate, Manuel Sidre, got close to 6% of the votes. So we're already seeing the people of Puerto Rico looking for options outside of the two-party system. Obviously, that accelerated after the Promesa came into effect, and particularly given the situation that has happened after Hurricane Maria. The people of Puerto Rico, regardless of their party affiliation, understand that the United States government has failed the people of Puerto Rico. The response that we got after Hurricane Maria was not necessarily the response that we deserved. It was not the response that the people of Puerto Rico were expecting. And to this day, there's still people in Puerto Rico living on their tarps. There's still people of Puerto Rico living under very, very precarious conditions. And that has created an environment in which people are looking for different options. I think the two-party system, not only the Commonwealth Party here in Puerto Rico, but the statehood party, has lost a lot of traction within the last couple of years. And people that usually parties, and even people recently or in the last couple of elections have stopped voting. They're looking for different options, and that's when Victoria Ciudadana comes in, not as another political party, but as a movement that it's born out of the need for a political revolution in Puerto Rico, out of a movement that's born out of the need of a vehicle that really represents the interests of the people of Puerto Rico and not corporate interests, not financial interests, not the interests of the buitres and the corruptos that have been ruling this island for so many years.
Manuel Natal, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Independent member of Puerto Rico's House of Representatives, also a member of the growing grassroots organization Victoria Ciudadana. Coming up, we go to Brazil, where the deforestation of the Amazon is rapidly escalating under President Jair Bolsonaro. The equivalent of 3 soccer fields are being destroyed every minute. Stay with us.
Esta gente piensa que están ciegos, se roban todo del país. Que pantalones ni tratan de esconderlo y solo nos dejan cantar. Esta gente piensa que estamos ciegos, qué sorpresa le daremos. A la calle todos a reclamar lo que le pertenece al pueblo, que aquí ya se acabó el pan. Ya se acabó el pan. Ya se acabó el pan.
Pan pan sin mantequilla. That's bread without butter by Ani Cordero. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Brazil, where new government data shows that deforestation in the Amazon has dramatically increased since the far-right former military officer Jair Bolsonaro became president in January. Brazil has lost more than 1,300 square miles of forest cover this year, and the pace of deforestation is increasing. One report claims that the equivalent of 3 soccer fields are being deforested every minute in the Amazon. In June, deforestation increased by 88% over the same month last year. The drastic spike is due to Bolsonaro's rolling back of regulations and allowing illegal land invasions, logging, and burning. In May, a group of former Brazilian environment ministers warned, quote, we're facing the risk of runaway deforestation in the Amazon. One former minister said that Brazil was becoming an exterminator of the future.
Climate scientists say the protection of the Amazon rainforest is crucial in the global effort to fight climate catastrophe. Bolsonaro has defended his administration's actions and has publicly criticized the National Institute for Space Research, which released the government data showing the spike in deforestation. Meanwhile, in other news from the Amazon, residents of a remote indigenous village say at least 10 heavily armed gold miners in military uniforms raided their community last week, stabbing a village leader to death. Joining us in Sao Paulo, Brazil, is Carlos Retiel. He's the executive secretary of the Climate Observatory, a network of Brazilian civil society organizations. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Dr. Retiel. Can you lay out the crisis and the far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, promising to, quote, open up the Amazon to development, what this has meant?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. What happens is that President Jair Bolsonaro was elected promising with an anti-environmental campaign. Now he's delivering, unfortunately. He has reduced the environmental governance. The department responsible to combat deforestation, the Ministry of Environment, was shut down. The number of operations to combat deforestation has been reduced between January and April this year. It was reducing in 70% in the number of operations in comparison to the same period of last year. And what happens is that he has a speech, a message that he delivers and express tolerance with environmental crimes. And when he says that he will foster the mining within the indigenous lands, and you see at the same day, in the same day the crime against one of the leaders of one community, the YMP in the state of Amapá, this is exactly the result of an agenda moving on. And you've mentioned deforestation in June, more than 80% above the same month of last year, as recorded by the National Space Agency. But in July, only until the 24th of July, the deforestation rate for this month is 212% above the deforestation rate registered last year by the National Space Agency. Unfortunately, with this, the violence against indigenous peoples comes along with the deforestation, the forest destruction, and the policies in place, and the lack of proper governance, and the lack of law enforcement don't give us good signals for the future. We could see the escalation of the crimes, and you have mentioned the Global Witness report just a couple of minutes ago, when before we started speaking, and Brazil is one among the top countries where environmental defenders are murdered every year. And unfortunately, the deforestation might rise very fast in the coming month. And together with that, the violence against the indigenous people and local communities might rise also, unfortunately.
And Carlos Ritil, could you talk about the person in charge of all of this for President Bolsonaro, the Environment Minister, Ricardo Salles? What's his background and his record?
Well, actually, he was a former secretary at the state level in São Paulo, the Secretary of Environment for the state of São Paulo a couple of years ago. And well, during the time he was there, and he was sued and considered guilt by irregularities, exactly providing permits for the economic activities to be run in not following fully the legislation, the state level legislation, and so he was sued. I think this is a very important record of his career in the environment. And many of the employees at the state level at the time from different institutes were blaming him, saying that he was a bad manager. And right now, what he did together with the President Bolsonaro was what he's doing is to dismantle the environmental legislation, the environmental governance of the country, and also he's now reviewing the size and the area and the level of protection of 334 protected areas at the federal level, and it could be reduced in the future based on the analysis of him. And he keeps speaking with land grabbers, with illegal loggers, rather than speaking with scientists and speaking with the former environmental ministers and with the leaders of the environmental agency at the federal level. And he's not there delivering, and he's not there to protect the environment. He's there to open the protected areas and to open the forest for activities to run without any control.
In northern Brazil, you talked about this. Residents of a remote indigenous village say at least 10 heavily armed gold miners in military uniforms raided their community last week, stabbing their leader to death, the Mira Waipi. On Monday, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, said, quote, the murder of Mira Waipi, leader of the indigenous Waipi people, is tragic and reprehensible in its own right. It's also a disturbing symptom of the growing problem of encroachment on indigenous land, especially forests, by miners, loggers, and farmers in Brazil. The president, Jair Bolsonaro, even denies that he was murdered. But if you can explain what happened and then go deeper into what the deforestation of the Amazon means for the world, called the lungs of the world. But start with the Waipi.
Well, the problem with these indigenous groups that they are there in areas that illegal loggers, miners, they have interests there. They are interested in invading those lands and taking the gold and timber from these areas, but this is illegal. We have very strict rules for activities to be carried on within the indigenous lands. But the speech and the message and the positions that the President Bolsonaro delivers in public, they incentivize the invasion. We have right now 20,000 illegal miners in the Yanomami indigenous lands in the state of Roraima, in the northern Amazon as well. And so these people just feel that they have a partner in the cabinet in Brasilia, because he's fostering, and he's as I said before, in the very first day, the same day when the YMP leader was murdered, the President Bolsonaro said he would open indigenous lands for mining. And so those guys entering the land, what they expect is that at some point their activity will be legalized, sort of formalized, and so that they will be able to stay there and to remain there doing their activities, and unfortunately they're harming the environment and also the indigenous people. In terms of the impacts of deforestation, of course, the Amazon is the home of the highest percentage of world's biodiversity. And chopping down trees, chopping down forests, and the speed that we are doing helps us to enter in this mass extinction of biodiversity worldwide. And so the fast speed of Amazon destruction helps that, unfortunately. But we don't lose only the biodiversity. The forests are very important for local people, not only indigenous people. We have the local communities that depend on the forests for their livelihoods. They extract their natural products from the forest. They fish, and so they depend of a good environment for keep the quality of their livelihoods, and also. The Amazon plays a very important role for the climate balance at the local level, regional level, at the global level. Deforestation is the main source of greenhouse gas emissions for Brazil. Brazil is in the top 7 global emitters of greenhouse gases, and the destruction of the Amazon is our main source of. It's about 50% of Brazilian greenhouse gas emissions comes from the gross deforestation in the Amazon. And so if we lose forest at the speed that we are doing, this might put us in risk of not meeting the Paris Agreement emissions reductions goals in the long term, to keep the global warming well below 2 degrees, and then possibly to keeping the rise in the temperature in 1.5 degrees Celsius to the end of this century. And so it's a problem for Brazil and also for the world if we keep doing destroying forests at the speed that we are facing right now.
And could you describe the turnaround in Brazilian policy on the Amazon, specifically from the period of the Workers' Party rule of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff to now what Bolsonaro is doing? How big a turnaround is this, or has this represented for the environmental movement?
Well, actually, since the impeachment process of former President Dilma, the balance of power has shifted a lot. When the vice president, the former vice president Michel Temer became president, he was allied with rural caucus and the National Congress. For example, the votes from rural caucus prevented him of being investigated by the federal prosecutors. And what he gave to those members of parliament and the National Congress was to approve laws to legalize, easily legalize land grabbing, and to withdraw fines, huge fines against illegal loggers and farmers, and a series of attempts to reduce protected areas. But at that time, even during the former Vice President Temer, we had the Minister of Environment who were there dialoguing with the civil society, dialoguing with the scientists, and so they were not there not allowing everything to happen without any control. And even the minister in place during the Vice President Michel Temer, he was attempting to enforce the combat to illegal deforestation. From the first mandate from President Lula in 2004, something that was remarkable was the establishment of a national plan to combat deforestation in the Amazon. This was extremely important because by implementing this plan, we were able to see the level of Amazon destructions coming down from in about 50% between 2004 and 2012. The level of destruction has been fluctuating since then, but in something between 5,000 square kilometers every year to 7,000 square kilometers a year, which is still very high, but much lower than the rates that we observed back in 2004, for example. It was almost 30,000 square kilometers of forest destroying in 1 year. But right now we have a president who's implementing an anti-environmental agenda and a minister of environment who's not there to protect the environment. And the Rural Caucus has appointed this minister, and also the Minister of Agriculture. And together with that, we see attempts of the President Bolsonaro to withdraw the demarcation of indigenous lands from the Minister of Justice and to put this under the control of the Minister of Agriculture. And so we have a very different condition, at least in the federal government level right now. We have an agenda being carried on, which is against indigenous people's rights, against in the environment, and the consequences are those reported by you, the rise in deforestation and violence, such as in the case of Amapá.
Dr. Carlos Rutil, we want to thank you so much for being with us again. The president of Brazil declaring the Amazon is ours and calling deforestation data lies. In May, 8 former Brazilian environment ministers writing a joint letter warning we are facing the risk of runaway deforestation in the Amazon. Dr. Carlos Rutil is Executive Secretary of Climate Observatory, a network of Brazilian civil society organizations, speaking to us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Coming up, we look at the privately owned Stewart Detention Center in Georgia, where at least 4 immigrants have died over the past 2 years, including one last week. Stay with us.
Same braços, sem pernas, sem moedas num pote, sem uma boca grande pra dizer acode, estamos aí à sua mercê. Ele chegou aqui cheio de ferramentas, desavenças, falsas crenças, em aço, soberba, concreto e poder. Você vai me ver assim, numa caixa de vidro, ou em leilão de alma por quilo. Aqui jaz a mãe natureza. Não quero dizer que se a janela da alma tem uma trava, limpe seus olhos que tudo se acalma. Plural, quarta pessoa, verbo proteger.
I'm alive and vivo, muito vivo. Feel the sound of music banging in my belly. And I know that one day I must die.
I'm Alive, a song for Brazil's rainforest by Caetano Veloso. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Georgia, where a 44-year-old immigrant from Mexico died last week at Stewart Detention Center, one of the largest immigration jails in the United States, and one that has been plagued by allegations of neglect and abuse for years. Pedro Arriago Santoya was the fourth person to die at Stewart in just 2 years, and the seventh person to die while in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement since October. An immigration judge had ordered Arriago Santoya to be deported in June. Instead, he was transferred to Stewart on July 10th as his removal proceedings continued. 2 weeks later, he was pronounced dead at a Georgia hospital. He had complained of abdominal pain and later went into cardiac arrest.
Last year, federal records obtained by the Atlanta public radio station WABE and Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting unveiled serious issues at Stewart, including chronic shortages of medical and other staff, drug smuggling, and long-term use of solitary confinement. In the documents, the facility's conditions were described by some staff as, quote, a ticking time bomb. Between May 2017 and July 2018, 3 immigrants died while detained at Stewart, a private immigration jail owned by the mega corporation CoreCivic. For more, we go to Atlanta, Georgia, where we're joined by Azadeh Shashahani, legal and advocacy director at Project South, former president of the National Lawyers Guild. Project South currently involved in 3 class action lawsuits against Stewart and CoreCivic. Azadeh, thank you so much for joining us. Start off by telling us about Pedro Arriaga Santoya, what happened to him, and then how this fits into a bigger picture.
Thank you very much for having me. So there is not a whole lot of information available at this point about the death of Mr. Arriago Santoya. All we have is the press statement that ICE put out that a lot of media outlets are unfortunately relying on, which is really a mistake in light of the pattern of ICE lies when it comes to abuse and deaths of immigrants at immigration detention centers, including Stewart. What we do know is that he, complained of pain and medical issues, and at some point he was transferred to a hospital. But what led to the medical issues that he experienced is something that we still do not know, and we hope and very much demand an independent investigation into the circumstances of this death, as well as the 3 other deaths that have happened at the Stewart Detention Center, 2 of them by suicide, where men with mental health issues were placed in solitary confinement for prolonged periods. In one case, a 27-year-old Giancarlo Jimenez Joseph was left in solitary for 19 days before he hung himself. And then, very similar circumstances, Efrain de la Rosa, a 40-year-old man, was held in solitary confinement for 21 days. He also had mental health issues, and he hung himself as well.
Could you talk about the record at Stewart? There was a report back in May of 2017 by Project South and the Penn State Law Center for Immigrant Rights Clinic, which detailed the testimonies of people who had been detained there. What is that record?
It's a horrible record. You have issues ranging from lack of adequate access to medical care to solitary confinement. People just complaining about their conditions of detainment are placed in solitary. Sometimes we're just, talking back to the guards. To the issue of forced labor at this immigration detention center, which, as you mentioned, is operated by one of the richest and the biggest prison corporation in the country. In the past, its revenues have been in the range of $178 million, and yet this prison corporation relies on the forced labor of detained immigrants and pays them between $1 to $4 a day. And it is very much forced labor, even though the government and the corporation claim it's voluntary. We know for a fact that immigrants, including our plaintiff, Shoaib Ahmed, in the class action lawsuit that we currently have pending against CoreCivic, actually complained about not having been paid for a few days. The meager pay that they were supposed to pay him, which was $4 a day. They hadn't paid him for several days, and he said, okay, well, there's not going to be work tomorrow. And so for that, he was placed in solitary confinement for 10 days, where basically he only had an hour to shower every other day, and he was held in a cell for 23 hours a day. We are in touch with him. He has since been deported to Bangladesh, and he still continues to experience trauma from the experience he had at Stewart.
You are one of the most vocal voices around this for-profit private detention center. Can you talk about what you're calling for now, and how has the situation changed under President Trump, Azadeh?
Well, we have called for Stewart to be shut down for about 10 years now, since 2009, when Georgia Detention Watch, a coalition we're involved with, put out the first report on the abuse of immigrants. We called for this detention center to be shut down. Our calls repeatedly went ignored. We had another death. Roberto Medina Martinez, a 39-year-old immigrant, died of a treatable heart infection in 2009. Still, the government did nothing. We put out this report, this most recent report, in 2017. ICE, started talking to the media and saying that our report was false, and then people started dying. A few days later, Giancarlo Jimenez Joseph died of suicide after being placed in solitary. And, we've had this really atrocious record of deaths just in the past 2 years, and I think it speaks to the atmosphere of impunity under this administration, where ICE, where CoreCivic employees that run the facility, other entities that might be involved, feel a sense of impunity, that they're not going to be held accountable regardless of how they treat detained immigrants at this isolated facility.
They're putting them in solitary confinement, even those, for example, the two who committed suicide who suffered from schizophrenia?
Yes, exactly. Where we know that, according to the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, placing people in solitary for any more than 2 weeks amounts to degradable and inhumane punishment. And ICE even itself has strict rules for when people should be placed in solitary. So when a person is already suffering from mental health issues, definitely they should not be placed in solitary confinement, and yet they continue to do that when people complain about mental health issues instead of actually providing them with the care that they need.
We have less than a minute left, but what have local officials or leaders there in the state doing about this, or have attempted to do?
Well, speaking out, we had a victory back in September of 2018, where the mayor of the city of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, finally decided to basically hold true to the rhetoric of Atlanta being a welcoming city, and stopped detaining immigrants at the Atlanta City Detention Center. And now it looks like the jail is not going to be no more. It might be turned into a community center, which is a really positive development. So that example is really hopeful. We hope that officials at the state level, congressional representatives whom we have called on repeatedly. Project South was joined by 70 local and national organizations after our report came out in a letter to the Georgia congressional delegation.
We have about 10 seconds.
asking them to initiate an investigation, and we continue to ask them to do so.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, and of course we'll continue to investigate these stories. Azadeh Shashahani, Legal and Advocacy Director for Project South, currently involved in a class action lawsuit against CoreCivic, which runs the Stewart Detention Facility, former president of National Lawyers Guild, and was the director of National Security and Immigrants' Rights Project for the ACLU of Georgia. Happy birthday to Jemiah Lewis.